Send a very special welcome to our two eminent guest speakers from abroad, Professor Jayashree D. Sachs, the Director at Center for Sustainable Development in Columbia University, and Professor Johan Rockström, Director, Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research at Germany. They have taken out time from their extremely busy schedules to be with us this evening. We are extremely honored, Dr. Sachs and Dr. Rockström, to have you with us. I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to our three discussants, Shri P.D. Rai, Ms. Jayashree Nandi, and Ms. Naaya Mehta, for kindly accepting our invitation to join in the panel discussion. Last, but by no means the least, I would like to welcome our moderator for this evening, Professor K. Srinath Reddy, who is responsible for conceptualizing and putting together this evening's discussion. Our grateful thanks to you, Professor Reddy. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening's discussion marks a very special occasion for us here at India International Center. This is the first program that the center is organizing to mark our Diamond Jubilee year. As many of you would be aware, Center was inaugurated on 22nd of January 1962 by the then Vice President of India, Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan. To commemorate this special occasion, the center is organizing a year-long celebration by way of conducting a variety of programs like talks, discussions, seminars, special performances, and exhibition, and so on. We are advised in our endeavors by a Diamond Jubilee Organizing Committee. The committee has constituted 6 subject cluster groups to identify and conceptualize the programs to be conducted. Professor K. Srinath Reddy, the President of Public Health Foundation of India, very kindly accepted our invitation to be the convener of the cluster group on pandemic and climate change. And we are delighted Professor Reddy has conceptualized the very first program of the Diamond Jubilee celebrations. May I once again welcome each one of you. And with this, I now hand over the evening's proceedings to Professor Reddy. Professor Reddy.
Thank you very much. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings to the India International Center as it celebrates 60 years of illustrious life, where it was both a catalyst and a witness to many great events that took place in India as well as globally. And as this year unfolds with a calendar of many events, we indeed do look to the future with hope for many more things for humanity, which will benefit all of us. But we also meet with a sense of foreboding about the challenges of the future, particularly what the climate crisis is bringing to us in terms of a threat to the stability of our planet and even of our collective survival. Unfortunately, this threat is not eliciting the concerted global response that it demands, certainly not with the speed and alacrity or with the consensual collaboration among all nations that is required. Beyond the impact that an unchecked climate crisis will have on the immediate present, the effects on future generations too impose a moral responsibility on us to address the topic of climate change and planetary boundaries today. We have 2 global thought leaders to describe the challenges, dissect the state of our response, and direct us to the solutions. I have a great pleasure in inviting our first eminent speaker. Professor Jayashree Sachs is a world-renowned professor of economics, best-selling author, innovative educator, and global leader in sustainable development. And may I say, a great friend of India. Professor Sachs serves as the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at the Columbia University, where he holds the rank of university professor, which is the university's highest academic rank. Professor Sachs held the position of director of the Earth Institute at the Columbia University from 2002 to 2016. He is currently the president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He is the chair of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission, co-chair of the UN Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition, commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development, and many other commissions that he graces with his presence and intellect. He is an academician at the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences at the Vatican and serves as a special advisor to the UN Secretary General. In fact, he served as the Secretary General's advisor for the United Nations, as helping and guiding the successive UN Secretary Generals Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, and Antonio Guterres. Professor Sachs has authored and edited numerous books, including 3 New York Times bestsellers. He was the co-recipient of the 2015 Blue Planet Prize, the leading global prize for environmental leadership. He was twice named among the Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders. He has received 38 honorary doctorates, the Tuba Academy Prize from the Turkish Academy of Sciences, Legion d'Honneur by the decree of the President of the Republic of France, and the Order of Cross from Estonia, and several honorary doctorates. Prior to joining Columbia, Professor Sachs spent over 20 years as a professor at the Harvard University. Over to you, Professor Sachs.
Srinath, thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for organizing this symposium this evening, and also for all of your global leadership. What a joy it is to celebrate the Diamond Jubilee of the India International Center. I can't go back 60 years with the India International Center, but I do go back 30 years because for the long time that I've been coming to India, I have always visited the India International Center. I stayed at the International Center many, many times. The dining hall is a place for incredible meetings and conversation. Walking in the gardens is a splendid joy. And the India International Center represents the greatest virtues of India and of, I think, our world of bringing together people for problem solving, for mutual understanding, for global cooperation. It truly is an international place and a revered place. So celebrating the 60th anniversary and helping to celebrate the launch of the next 60 years is a tremendous joy. And how smart it is for Srinath Reddy to put together 2 major themes: the pandemic, which we still are, of course, in the midst of massive crisis, and the climate change crisis. They are both global. They are both a test of our capacity to cooperate. They are both signs of our need for dramatically new politics and new institutions. The pandemic was a test for us and has been, and we are not passing this test, I'm afraid. We have officially around 6 million deaths so far, still rising rapidly. By statistical count, taking into account excess mortality in many parts of the world, the better estimate is probably at least twice that number, more than 12 million deaths around the world. And I would say, even to this date, to this very date, a lack of meaningful international cooperation. This is a crisis that has been met country by country with only, unfortunately, the weakest of global collaboration. To this date, to my knowledge, the leading vaccine producing countries, technical experts, representatives of the companies, have still not met. I'm thinking of the United States, UK, European Union, Russia, China, and India. Because here is the place where almost all of the global production is taking place, where almost all of the cutting edge technology is known. And yet this issue of vaccines has been handled as with so many other issues recently as a part of nationalist policies, as a part of competition, as a privatization of what should be a public good. And without the international standards, norms, prudence that logic and morality calls for. And while my topic is climate change today, the pandemic is a backdrop to the climate change issue, because to solve either issue requires a very high level of global cooperation, a high level of honesty and transparency that all too few political systems demonstrate and governments demonstrate, a readiness to share knowledge, to develop new solutions, to ensure that all parts of the world participate in those solutions. And therefore, what we're learning about ourselves and about the world during this 2 years and ongoing pandemic tells us a lot about what will happen with the climate change crisis as well. In fact, with climate change, though it doesn't have the doubling time of a week or two of the COVID crisis, it is a crisis that has been in motion for decades and known for decades, still today, without the response that is needed. We are at the 30th anniversary of the signing of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, in which our governments pledged to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system, a decision taken in 1992. And of course, we still have not only rising greenhouse gas concentrations, we haven't even put a peak to greenhouse emissions, the flow. And the stock, of course, will continue to rise for decades. We have arrived, as of 2022, with a warming of 1.2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels. India experiences record heat waves and temperatures with absolutely shocking frequency, sometimes 50 degrees Celsius temperatures. And this dislocation is occurring all over the world. The evidence on climate, and I'm going to be followed by one of the world's great experts and leading one of the world's most important and prestigious institutes, Johan Rockström, and he can and will no doubt elaborate, but the evidence is that the rate of warming is itself accelerating. My colleague James Hansen, the world great climatologist, estimates that we have roughly doubled the rate of decadal warming from 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade to around 0.36 degrees Celsius per decade. And what that means, since we're already at 1.2 degrees Celsius warming, we could easily breach the 1.5 degree limit set in the Paris Agreement within the next few years. One strong El Nino could push us over that limit. We have had La Nina conditions in the last couple of years, but as Professor Hansen has recently written, if an El Nino comes in 2023 or 2024, the results would be, of course, new record temperatures, but could push us above the 1.5 degrees Celsius. Where do we stand on action? We don't. We have made some rhetorical progress, thanks in no small part to PIC, the institute that Johan leads. The world did identify a temperature limit, first 2 degrees Celsius, and then aiming for well below 2 degrees Celsius, and now 1.5 degrees Celsius upper limit, the one that we're unlikely to succeed in containing. The world has identified that in order to achieve that limit, we need to stop greenhouse emissions by mid-century. And so this is progress. Many governments have made a commitment to reach net zero by 2050. But everywhere, despite the obvious dangers, despite the rising temperatures, despite the foreboding forecasts, despite the treaties and agreements, despite the pledges, despite the multiple studies, despite the declarations, we do not take the action. When I look in my own country, we see how tragic all of this is and how shambolic, if I could use that phrase. The United States Senate has not voted one significant piece of climate legislation since signing the Framework Convention on Climate Change. For 30 years, we have not had a law. And when we try to understand why that is, it's not public opinion. It is political corruption. The chairman of the US Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, is a corrupt politician who owns 2 coal companies and is chairman of the Senate committee that oversees energy policy. So despite President Biden announcing many strong goals, we have not had one piece of legislation under the Biden administration and may possibly never have such a piece of legislation. What to do is not so dissimilar to COVID, in that even from the outbreak of COVID, the basic steps of public health, developing a vaccine, as well as the physical distancing, the face mask wearing, the other precautions, and then speeding the technological solutions has been clear, but not properly implemented. And with climate, we similarly have a technological pathway through decarbonization that can take us not to climate safety, because we're past that point, but at least to avoidance to the maximum extent possible of the very real risks of runaway change by breaching the planetary thresholds that Johan Rockström has done so much to explain and to make known to the world. So the technological pathways are there, but the politics, the short-termism, the lack of cooperation, the lack of insight, the lack of basic ethical standards still stand in the way. I want to conclude not on this absolutely somber note, because the basic point for us is that there is a path forward that is not only a way to address this crisis, but a way to sustainable development, meaning addressing the crisis in the context of continuing human betterment, ending poverty, and achieving social justice worldwide. We are not short of solutions. We have been short of the spirit of cooperation and the spirit of decency needed to implement those solutions. But I think it's fitting that we're discussing this at the India International Center, which is a worldwide center of not only intellectual excellence, but of moral virtues and international cooperation. And so we can't have a better venue and a better occasion than to look ahead and redouble our efforts towards success. Thank you for inviting me. I can't wait to be back in Delhi sometime soon at the India International Center. And I am so delighted to be celebrating the Diamond Jubilee. Back to you, Srinath.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. I hope you can stay on for a little while to have
absolutely
brief Q&A. Thank you. Before I introduce Professor Johan Rockström, may I invite people who are interested in asking questions to use the Q&A box to post their questions, which will be curated, and then we will try and cover as many questions as possible after Professor Rockström finishes his talk. Professor Rockström is the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He is also a professor at the Institute of Earth and Environmental Science at the Potsdam University, and a professor in water systems and global sustainability at the Stockholm University. Professor Rockström gained international recognition with the development of the Planetary Boundaries Framework, which has since become a standard of sustainability science. His research has covered several areas related to this, posing the research question: what is the safe operating space for humanity's future on Earth, and which sustainable transformations can take us there? He received the prestigious European Research Council Advanced Grant and is ranked as one of the most influential and most cited scientists in the world by Clarivate Analytics. Professor Rockström provided strategic scientific guidance as a member of the European Commission's expert group, Mission Board for Adaptation to Climate Change, and various scientific academies, including the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina. He has been a speaker, a resource person, and often a chairperson of various committees at various fora, including the World Economic Forum, the UN General Assembly, the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He is also the chief scientist of Conservation International. Professor Rockström's work has been recognized with several accolades, the most recent of which include the Prince Albert II of Monaco Climate Change Award and the Hillary Laureate by the Hillary Institute of International Leadership, the French distinction Knight of the Legion of Honor, the German Environmental Award, and the International Cosmos Prize. Before becoming the director of the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research, Professor Rockström founded the Stockholm Resilience Center at the Stockholm University and was executive director at the Stockholm Environment Institute. Over to you, Professor Rockström, to talk to us about the planetary boundaries which are crumbling at the moment.
Thank you so much, Srinath, and it's a privilege to be with you all at this important Diamond Jubilee. I'm sharing my slides. I hope you can see them here. What I'll be doing is, not surprisingly, basically providing the scientific evidence behind Jeffrey Sachs' phenomenal overview over both the challenges we're facing and the transformative pathway we have ahead. Scientifically, we know we are at a planetary emergency point, and we need to transform into a prosperous, equitable future where we need to govern all the global commons in the Earth system to have any chance of a safe landing. And a kind of an obvious starting point for someone who's coming at this through a planetary boundary lens, but focusing in to start with on the climate agenda, is that I think scientifically we can argue that we came to Glasgow and COP26 last year at a decisive moment where we know that this was our last chance to really set the journey towards a net zero, fossil fuel free world economy by mid-century. We came to Glasgow on a pathway to disaster, a pathway that would take us on average to a 2.7 degrees Celsius average mean temperature on Earth by the end of this century, the blue column you see here. This is a place we haven't been in on planet Earth for the past 4 to 5 million years. It is unknown terrain. We left Glasgow after the update of all the nationally determined contributions, the pledges on methane, on deforestation, halting deforestation, but also all the net zero pathway pledges that could, if everything is implemented, take us just below 2 degrees Celsius. So we left Glasgow on a pathway to danger. Now that is a significant progress, but just as Jeff pointed out, there's zero delivery so far. There are a lot of promises. So analytically, we've kind of turned a corner in terms of starting at least to see the right type of decisions being taken, still not sufficient, but now the question is delivery time. It's accountability time and it's delivery time, and it's the decisive decade to do this because we know that science is clear here. We need to cut emissions by half every decade to have any chance of a safe landing. That frustration collides with a scientific risk assessment, which you see on the left-hand side of this slide. This is so far unpublished data. It comes from the Earth Commission, the first attempt of doing like an IPCC assessment of the entire planet to define a safe and just corridor for humanity's future on Earth, showing that when you map all the tipping point systems on Earth, and I'll come back to them, the actual limit between moderate risk and high risk creeps down to 1.5 degrees Celsius. What does this mean? Well, it means that on the one hand, we have more and more support, as Jeff Sachs summarized so eloquently, that we are not making progress to deliver the Paris range of well below 2, aiming at 1.5, while at the same time, we receive more and more scientific evidence that even 1.5 is a real planetary boundary. It's a point beyond which we enter a high-risk domain of crossing irreversible tipping points, ranging from Tibetan glaciers undermining freshwater supply to 1 billion people, to collapse of coral reef systems, the Amazon rainforest, and potentially triggering irreversible loss of the Greenland ice sheet. So we are truly, however we turn this, moving in a very dangerous direction. Now, the journey ahead is transformative, and you can describe that in many ways, but this is one of them that The Economist actually published just before Glasgow, showing for the big economies in the world the journey towards the promised net zero pledges. Just look at China, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, has now promised to peak no later than 2030 and reach net zero by 2060. That's a tremendous pledge that still is not aligned with science. It's up to 10% per year of emission reductions at an annual pace. Then you look at the United Nations, the United States, the European Union, Japan, Canada, that also have tremendous pathways ahead if they are to have any chance of actually landing at net zero by 2050, which are their pledges. I've added here in the white line India's pledge that was put on the table at COP26. Many in the end of the COP meeting complained on India for not accepting the terminology phasing out fossil fuels and argued for phasing down, not recognizing that India now joins the alliance of 100 nations actually in the world that are committing to move towards the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era, and that the world must recognize that this is, of course, a very challenging transition for economies like the Indian economy that still has over 50% of its electricity and heat originating from fossil fuels, from coal. And this is something that we now increasingly need to truly integrate, the scientific necessity with the social challenge of an orderly phase out. Now, why do we have this challenge? Why have we kind of run out of time, banging our heads into a necessity of reaching zero in one generation? Well, it's simply because we're running out of carbon budget. This is a table from the IPCC 6 assessment that came out a few months ago, showing that to have a 2/3 chance of a safe landing at 1.5, the climate planetary boundary I mentioned in the beginning, it gives us only on average 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide to emit. 400 divided by 40, which is what we emit per year today, gives us only 10 years remaining at current level of emissions. So this just shows that we are simply running out of time and need to accelerate. But the challenge is, and this is what will be the focus in my continued part of this talk, that it's not enough to just follow the gray part here, which is phasing out coal, oil, and natural gas in 30 years' time to reach net zero, a net zero world economy by 2050. Oh no, all climate models in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that takes us safely towards a 1.5 degrees Celsius future, also already assumes in the modeling runs that food system in the world, agriculture, will transition from the net largest source of emissions, the brown wedge, to become the net single largest sink of carbon, the orange wedge, an agricultural revolution. But it also assumes scaling, massive scaling of CCS, carbon capture and storage, and different engineering technologies for carbon capture, shown in orange. But not only that, the models also assume, no surprise, in nature, that nature will continue to be this phenomenal, stable carbon sink on land in green and oceans in blue. And if all this delivers, that you have a sustainability pathway on nature, technology being scaled on CCS, and agricultural transition, plus cutting emissions by half, we have a 2/3 chance of landing at 1.5. So it is a truly sustainability transformation that we have in front of us over the coming years and decades. This is why we need to guide human development, the world economy, within planetary boundaries, because the planetary boundaries is an attempt from science to define all the big Earth system processes, think of them as the environmental systems that we have scientific evidence regulates the state of the planet and thereby also the state of the climate system. And that for all of these systems, 9 of them having been identified and scrutinized and over again reassessed to also quantify a safe operating space, shown here in green, for these 9s on measurable indicators that we can use as a guide for our development. This guide, unfortunately, gives us some dire information right now. This is the 2015 update showing that for 4 of the 9 boundaries, we are either in a danger zone in yellow or in a high risk zone in red. Not surprisingly, it's climate change, but it's also biodiversity loss. The fact that we are in a mass extinction phase of losing ecological functions and services, both on land and in ocean, but also land system change. We're cutting down forest at a pace that is losing massive carbon sinks and functions in the hydrological cycle, and also overloading the biosphere with reactive nitrogen and phosphorus, predominantly through overuse of fertilizers. So we are eroding the resilience of the Earth system when we need a stable, healthy planet more than ever, to buffer the disturbance caused by climate. You may see the boundary called novel entities there, which is unquantified. Well, 2-3 weeks ago now, a paper was published quantifying the novel entities boundary, concluding also here that yes, we have transgressed the safe boundary also on chemicals. So most likely today we can talk of 5 of 9 boundaries being outside of the safe space, giving us even larger challenge for a safe climate landing. Because for a safe climate landing, you want to have a strong planet. You don't want to have a planet that is losing its capacity for carbon buffering. And as Jeff pointed out, we are continuing to raise global emissions. I mean, this is one of the most shocking recognitions of all, that despite all the evidence, despite all the agreements, despite all the rhetorics, we're still continuing to increase emissions by something like 1-2% per year, and temperatures continue rising. Actually, 1.2 degrees Celsius warming, global mean surface temperature that we registered last year, is the warmest temperature on Earth since we left the last ice age 20,000 years ago. We are truly moving out already now from the only state of the planet, the Holocene, the last interglacial, the last 12,000 years. That is the only state we know can support modern civilizations as we know it. This is why we scientists, for the first time, are forced to research the following question. Are we at risk of destabilizing the entire system? Are we at risk of pushing the whole Earth system towards an irreversible drift away from a state that can support humanity? And where does this evidence come from? Well, the very origins of this is the 2008, shown to the left, first publication of the so-called tipping elements that regulates the climate system, the big biophysical systems that we have scientific evidence that regulates the state of the climate system. On the right-hand side, you see the 10-year update of this map, analyzing across all published research the state of these 15. And what you see to the right hand here are the 9, shown in black, tipping elements that are showing signs of instability, meaning that they are approaching tipping points. Not that they've crossed tipping points, but that they are approaching tipping points. But the most dramatic part of this analysis are the arrows, that we have more and more scientific evidence that there are cascades in between these systems. And recently, in conjunction with the Glasgow COP26, we released the 4th edition of the 10 New Insights in Climate Science, which we prepare each year, scanning off the most important advancements in climate science and handing it over to the climate negotiators at the COP meetings. One of these 10 is the risk of cascades among tipping elements. And here is one of them, that when the Greenland ice sheet accelerating its ice melt because of an amplified warming in the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the planet as a whole, it releases cold fresh water into the North Atlantic. This slows down the thermohaline engine that runs the whole heat overturning system in the North Atlantic, the AMOC, the so-called thermohaline overturning circulation that takes warm surface water, warm saline surface water from the Southern Ocean and takes it up to the Northern Hemisphere, releases it to the atmosphere, sinks down as heavy salt, fresh water, and runs back to the Southern Ocean. Now, this is slowed down by the ice melt in Greenland. It's slowed down by 15%. That, more and more science shows, pushes the large monsoon systems further south, which can explain why we have a higher frequency of drought and forest fires over the Amazon tipping element system, which then, of course, leads to higher frequency of carbon pulses into the atmosphere. But not only that, that when this whole overturning system is slowed down, it holds more warm saline surface water in the Southern Ocean, which can explain the accelerated melting of the West Antarctic ice shelf. So a cascade connection between the Arctic and Antarctica. And this is to be connected to the latest update on all the tipping element systems. This is an unpublished map showing the now 20 systems that have been identified as systems that fulfill 2 criteria. One is that they have multiple stable states. If you push them too far, they can irreversibly shift from a cooling and dampening system like a frozen ice sheet into a melted, liquid, darker system that absorbs more heat. So they have tipping points. And number two criteria is that they contribute to regulate the climate system. Now, the IPCC confirmed these 20, and for the first time, the sixth assessment had a whole table with a list of these systems, but they didn't attempt to put the temperature thresholds on them. Here you have the first attempt of doing that. This is unpublished data still, also coming from the Earth Commission, listing all the tipping elements as we have them scientifically documented. And what you see here, which is a real drama, that many of these tipping element systems, the width of the bars here, the scientific uncertainty range, but look at the average levels, which are the dotted lines. Many of them have scientific evidence that the average risk of crossing tipping points lies well below 2 degrees and comes already at 1.5. And this is what I started the talk with, that there's more and more support for 1.5 being a true boundary. The Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice shelf, coral reef systems, the Barents Sea ice, permafrost systems are at risk at lower temperatures than we previously thought. Is this a group of scientists coming out with this from one project in the world? Oh no, this is the direction of travel of the scientific consensus. Look here, this is 4 scientific IPCC assessments. 2001, third assessment of the IPCC 20 years ago, and the upper bar is the 1.5 degrees Celsius report from 2018. This is the famous red embers diagram. The darker the red, the higher the scientific risk assessment. And on the x-axis, you have global mean temperature. And the question is, in this graph, at what temperature do we risk causing nonlinear tipping points of deep concern in the Earth system, basically causing tipping points in the tipping elements of the Earth system? 20 years ago, the assessment was that this was at risk earliest at 5-6 degrees Celsius. It was basically a zero risk because nobody was suggesting that we would push the temperatures to that catastrophic level. Today, look at the science. It's actually down around the 2 degrees Celsius point where we're exactly in line with the previous assessment that I showed. And there's more evidence to this that you can use to provide even further support for the need for transformation. This graph, for example, is published data from 2 years ago. It's the first time a physical mathematical climate model reproduces the journey of our planet in terms of mean global temperature on the y-axis. The 0 point there is the average temperature before we started burning fossil fuels. Over the entire quaternary, this is 3 million years. And what you see here is that the planet has gone up and down, deep ice ages, up and warm interglacials, deep ice ages, based on normal natural variability in relation in particular to solar, the orbit around the sun. But we've never passed through the 2 degrees Celsius boundary. So interestingly, the warmest point of Earth over the past 3 million years, according to our latest understanding, has always been under 2 degrees. Now, the IPCC confirms this and shows that for the past 100,000 years, we've never passed 1 degree. But you see, the reason why this is so important to connect the planetary boundaries is that we know that one reason why we have been able to hold this line is that we have healthy nature on Earth. We recently published this paper showing that if we hadn't had functioning intact natural ecosystems on land, we would already have passed the 1.5 degrees Celsius mark. But unfortunately, we have more and more science like this showing, for example, that the Brazilian part of the Amazon rainforest has now tipped over already from a carbon sink to now being a carbon source. So we're seeing cracks in this ability of the Earth system to buffer and dampen disturbance. And the IPCC confirms even this, concluding that 56% of our emission of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel burning have been taken up by the biosphere, oceans and land. And can you imagine all the scenarios in the future that takes us safely to Paris, takes us safely well below 2, assumes that this capacity will continue. So to kind of round this up, the question is, can we achieve the sustainable development goals within planetary boundaries? And of course, Jeff Sachs is the grand master of driving this whole agenda. It started with the limits to growth and the Stockholm conference in 1972 with Indira Gandhi and the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme talking for the first time actually about equity, poverty alleviation, and how environment and development is a pathway to an equitable, prosperous future. we must unfortunately declare failure. We have made 50 years of attempts and we haven't made progress so far. We now have the Sustainable Development Goals. We have the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that Jeff Sachs set up, the world's largest knowledge network to help the implementation of the SDGs. But we have still not understood that these 17 goals must be seen in a hierarchy. There are 4 non-negotiable goals among the SDGs: the planetary boundaries, the freshwater, biodiversity, ocean, and climate SDGs. And within this, we can develop and must develop. Sir Partha Dasgupta, through the Economics of Biodiversity Commission, commissioned by the UK government, concluded the same thing. The pathway for economics in the future is strong sustainability, is an economy that develops within planetary boundaries, and that we need to set those guardrails or boundaries to guide innovation, equity, and transformation. So I would put the SDGs within the safe operating space of planetary boundaries. And together with Jeff Sachs, actually, we started the World in 2050 through his leadership and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals as a milestone towards a future for humanity within planetary boundaries. And I think that still stands. In fact, I even think it redefines sustainable development. Prosperity and equity within planetary boundaries. That's the point we've reached at this risky juncture of human pressures on Earth. And with that, I look forward to the discussion, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rockström. Clearly, you've outlined the serious dangers that await us. And even if we take energetic action at this point, we can only stall some of the dangers, we can't reverse it. There have been many questions directed. I'll try and cover as many of them as possible. First, let me start with you, Professor Rockström. What would be the 3 most serious adverse impacts of climate change in South Asia by the end of this decade?
Well, I think if we talk about the end of this decade, I think, because then we're talking really immediate impacts. And then it's no doubt still extreme events, extreme heat, extreme rainfall, extreme droughts. We see the frequency and the severity of these extreme events increasing. So that is on the real short term. Then on the medium term, of course, we have sea level rise combined with storms causing more and more coastal erosion. We see the freshwater supply from the Tibetan plateau being impacted very rapidly. We saw just yesterday the new findings that even parts of Mount Everest, glaciers are disappearing much faster than previously thought. But I would say on the short term, it really is heat, water scarcity, and extreme weather
Thank you.
Srinath, maybe I could add a word.
Sure, Jeff, please.
Yeah, there was first of all, what a wonderful presentation by Johan, and just so dismal and frightening and accurate. And just a couple quick words, if I might. When I was leading the Earth Institute, I was very lucky to have 2 completely remarkable colleagues. One who passed away, Wali, who coined the phrase global warming in 1974. He always said, we're poking the beast. And by that, he meant that the beast of nature is nonlinear, and you poke it enough and the response is going to be disastrous. So already 20 years ago, I was hearing about all of these tipping points. It was his research insight, the thermohaline circulation and others, that got me so alarmed. And Jim Hansen, the same way, has been saying to me for 20 years, 1.5 degrees, it's even too high. It's 1 degree is the limit. And I can tell you through every IPCC report, he said, it's wrong. They're too high. This is still too dangerous. And science has just continued to show how incredibly risky It is. But I quickly wanted to add two more things about the first book I read as a freshman, first year undergraduate at Harvard was Limits to Growth. So I go back 50 years in this also, together with Stockholm. My teacher said to the class, don't worry about it. This is bad modeling. Markets will solve this problem. That's what I was told 50 years ago. It's just shocking to me to reflect on, first of all, how brilliant that book was and how the Stockholm Conference, which will have its 50th anniversary, got us started. And Johan was so right to point to the conversation of Indira Gandhi and Olof Palme as initiating this global diplomacy. But that is 50 years that we've been on alert and have not yet been able to get this right. So lots of things came to mind as Johan was speaking.
Thank you. Professor Yogendra Alak had put in a comment saying that the law of entropy is catching up with us, like the pralay in the Indian beliefs. A couple of questions to you, Professor Sachs. What advice might you have for startups in financial products and services that can be created, which can help the fight against climate change? And coupled with that is, what would be the role of climate finance, especially in the context of developing countries like India, in trying to contain the climate crisis?
For the startups, if I were getting into business, I would go solar, 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 especially in the India context. Solar and digital and electrification of transport, which will also clean up the air, which India could really use. The basic pathway of what we need in technology is actually pretty clear. In fact, almost all the scenarios show the same thing. Massive increases of green energy, increases of green hydrogen, that is hydrogen made by a whole new industry, I should say, of green hydrogen made by zero carbon electricity, and electrification of just about everything, and all supported by digital. So this is the basic path, and the basic message for financial markets and entrepreneurs is go for that. You know, try to be Elon Musk in this. He had the insight, and his company is worth more than all the rest of the US automotive industry combined. And he started out just with an idea, not 100 years of an automotive industry. So green and digital, electrification, green hydrogen, go for it. In terms of, and that means that financial markets, which are not very clever often, by the way, very backward looking, part of conventional wisdom. Oh, we need fossil fuel for, you know, the foreseeable future and so forth. This is just wrong. And India's rhetoric also is wrong. Oh, we depend on coal, we're a poor country and so forth. This is just not the way to be dynamically safe. And what I was going to point out also, a very powerful book that this science fiction book, Ministry of the Future, I don't know if people know it in India, was a bestseller in the United States, about the 50 years of forthcoming climate disasters, and diplomacy starts with the disaster in India. And it's not, it's so sobering and very upsetting. And India of all places should understand, the Indian government of all places should understand, it needs to be the leading voice in the world. For God's sake, stop this. You're threatening us, even if you don't see what you're threatening to the rest of the world. So India is about the most vulnerable place on the planet to all of this. And India should be raising its voice the loudest to stop this unbelievable damage, not begging for more time. What's that mean? Of course, it also means, yes, we need a new international financial architecture for sure. I'm trying to work on that this year with the UN and the G20, because the international financial system really is rigged for the richest countries. And most of the poor countries have no creditworthy access because of the rating agencies and the systems that are used in the institutional framework. So we do need to unlock the financing. But I'd like to see India and the Indian politicians not saying, give us time, give us time. India has no time. Should be saying the opposite. You, rest of the world, you better accelerate. Our lives are on the line. And I think that's the real message that India needs to be conveying to the rest of the world.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. I think since you've been talking about India, there's been a question about US as well. The questioner says, the discourse on sustainable development is still imprisoned in the present structures of discourse and practice. We need new movements of evolutionary flourishing. It also calls for new leadership, new movements in civil society. What are some of these movements in the US which challenge the lame duck policies of President Biden?
Yeah, look, our problem is we're like the Brezhnev era of the Soviet Union in the United States. We have a septuagenarian and octogenarian generation in charge. All of our leading politicians, it seems, are 70 or 80. I have nothing against older people, except I don't think that they should be leading this effort. We have a president who is, I don't know, 77, 78. I don't even recall, maybe 79. Somebody could look it up. But between Trump and Biden and Pelosi and Mitch McConnell, boy, we've seen these people for 40 years. They are living in the past century. They're still in Cold War mentality. They're focusing on absolute wrong-headed things, in my view. So we need a generational change as well as a different direction of politics. We need a politics of sustainable development. That's as simple as that. We need our political parties organized around sustainable development. We need our global multilateral systems organized around cooperation. So why are we developing, for instance, this Quad? I mean, the United States, why is it spending so much time with India, Australia, Korea, Japan, trying to create a divide with China? This is terrible thinking. We don't need this kind of global confrontation. We need cooperation right now. But we're still in a Cold War mentality. We're still in an old geopolitics mentality. We're still in a zero-sum world. And we're not truly living in a zero-sum world. We're living in a world where we could achieve positive things, or whether we're all going to go down together. And that's the difference of our current political institutions, morality, approach, ethics, even how we train our students is so wrong-headed. All the international relations are about basically about non-cooperation and realism, so-called, but the only realism in this world today is cooperation. That's the only thing we should really be teaching and training, how to cooperate with each other.
Well, that brings it to a very logical next question, which has been posed by one of the listeners, and that just goes to Professor Rockström as well as you. So I'd probably start with Professor Rockström. Given the failure of collective action in the past 30 years by governments, what is your advice on building effective institutions for global public climate action? Scientific knowledge alone is clearly not enough. Marching on the streets seems to be getting us nowhere. What is required when social and economic inequities are accelerating? Professor Rockström, would you like to respond to this? Then we'll come to Professor Sachs.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I mean, it's Jeff is better placed than me on this, but I would say that, I mean, number one is that we have to take science-based leadership and science-based evidence and science-based governance to a new level. I think we're making some progress here. I mean, you of course follow one of the interesting trajectories, which is that after the Paris Climate Agreement, the legally binding Paris Accord was translated into the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is basically giving quantitative pathways year by year, decade by decade for businesses and cities around the world, countries around the world. We're now working very actively to do the same thing, to get science-based targets for all the planetary boundaries. This is a piece that's been missing. So I think that's one little piece of the puzzle. I say this because otherwise, I think there are two grand items that Jeff is much better placed to talk about than me. And one is the financial architecture. I think that's the number one. I mean, there's no way for us to navigate our future on Earth where we need to really have collective action to govern all the global commons, basically all the planetary boundaries, unless we have a financial architecture that gives social justice, that gives basically social dividends back to those who are custodians of the carbon sinks and all the biosphere functions and the stability of the Earth system. And number two is, I think there's only one path, which is to reform the United Nations. We need to have a Security Council which really aligns with Jeff's point about politics for sustainable development. We need a politics for sustainable development, but we have governance of security among a few countries that represented the old generation, the Cold War era, and this is of course not fit for purpose.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. Your take,
yeah,
please.
This is a huge challenge, and we should understand and appreciate how difficult and new the concept of multilateralism is. We're in the 100th anniversary of the very first attempt in humanity to do it, the League of Nations. That one flamed out terribly, and now we're in the 75th anniversary, basically, of the second attempt, the United Nations, which I devote my waking hours to every day, because I think it is our best hope. The UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights remain, for me, guideposts that are critical. They're not working all that well in the 21st century. One reason is because the United States, which was the champion of the UN, it was the vision of our greatest president, Franklin Roosevelt, who really was our greatest president. Now the United States, because we're completely confused, strongly right-wing country, we've turned our back on the United Nations substantially. The US is absolutely stuck in Cold War thinking, so we need new champions. Second, we need a multipolar world, not a world of a US superpower, which was an illusion even when it was declared in 1992, much less a Cold War world, whether it's US versus Soviet Union or US versus China. This way of thinking is so outmoded and just basically primitive. And, you know, India should not be part of a US alliance against China. This is crazy ideas. Are we really going to go down not only failing to address the major global challenges, but go down even fighting with each other in the midst of this? That makes no sense. Third, obviously, India needs to play a major role in the Security Council. There have been 20, 30, 40 years of debates about how to reform the Security Council, but there's one thing that's always there, which is that India is this single leading, maybe the only absolutely sure candidate to join the Security Council with 1.4 billion people and India's role in the world. This has to be done, but we need better structuring in general. One thing we really need, which again, in the Indian context is very important and very difficult, regional cooperation. Each region of the world should be cooperating, not only with the rest of the world, but within the region. And that means India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, South Asia. because you share the same ecosystems, the same renewable energy, the same drying rivers, the same Tibetan plateau. And this really needs to be worked out. And yet, of course, South Asia is one of the conflict hotspots of the whole world. It is just something that is so debilitating for us. So we need an architecture based on global cooperation. I think the UN Charter is still fit for purpose with some key reforms. I deeply believe in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which will have its 75th anniversary next year. We need strong regional entities, and we need to move past the mindset where one or two countries is, quote, world leaders. We need to move to a multipolar world very explicitly. And just when the United States says we're leader of the world, stop it already. You're not leading anything, even internally, I can tell you, in my own country. And so what we need is a cooperative approach, not the idea that because somebody has more nuclear arms or more military bases around the world, they're naturally a leader. And we need to stop the unilateralism. I'll just add, the sanctions regimes where one country, especially my own, says, you can't do this, you can't do that, and we say you can't use the international banking system unless you agree with us. This, again, is a kind of primitive approach to global politics that we need to overcome if we're going to solve all the problems that we're talking about today.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs and Professor Rockström. As the beautiful ride in the Disney World says, it's a small world after all. We all need to work together to protect it. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us, particularly during the Diamond Jubilee year of the India International Center. And I'm sure these debates will go on, but the kind of stimulation that you've provided us will certainly move us on the path to more informed discussion and debates. Thank you very much, Professor Rockström and Professor Sachs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye there.
Thank you.
Now we move on to the next part of our program, which is the panel discussion, where we will have representatives of the younger generation who have the most at risk in terms of their future, as well as a young journalist who also represents great commitment to the environmental causes. And we have also a senior politician who is also an intellectual and an academic who represents the statesmanly component of Indian politics to discuss what is the implication of what we have heard for India's future and how best we can actually counter that. May I first introduce Professor Premdas Rai. Shri Premdas Rai was a member of parliament from Lok Sabha, from the Sikkim constituency. He was elected in 2009 and re-elected in 2014. And he has the distinction of being the first member of the Indian Parliament with degrees from both the Indian Institutes of Technology and Indian Institutes of Management. Being a technology and a management expert, Mr. Rai is credited for introducing information technology and sustainable ecotourism to Sikkim. He was awarded the prestigious Eisenhower Fellowship of the United States of America for making tremendous contributions to Sikkim's economic and industrial growth. Ms. Jayashree Nandi is an assistant editor at the Hindustan Times. She primarily covers climate science and negotiations, environmental issues in India, such as air and water pollution, forests and wildlife government policies, government policies on the environment and their impact. She has over 13 years of experience in writing on environment. She won the Center for Media Studies Young Environmental Journalist Award of the Year in 2019. Ms. Naaya Mehta is a 11th grader currently pursuing her IB diploma, International Baccalaureate diploma at the Shri School, where she is also the deputy head of social initiatives. She is an ardent environmentalist. She has been a rapporteur for the World Health Organization's Southeast Asia Regional Office consultations for adolescent well-being. She is a certified UNITA trainee for the United Nations Future Leaders Program and is the India head of the Climate Science Explore in the Climate Science community. Naaya, let me begin with you. You've heard fairly dire predictions for the future, almost at a point of no return. How does that make you feel as a young person with a future to look ahead? And what does it mean for your generation?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. I think as of right now, youth sentiment is basically around 3-4 different things. The first of which is that obviously the climate crisis is more than anything else, it's a child rights crisis. It poses a bigger threat to children and young people by severely compromising our health, our education, our nutrition, our development, and our basic survival and future potential, right? And the issue really is that current and future generations of children will have to navigate an uncertain future where the prevailing model of growth that links economic development to environmental exploitation will no longer be available. And youth are anxious, and for good reason. The first is that our leaders and decision makers they have to balance both economic and environmental agenda. And as of right now, the sentiment is that both agendas are diametrically opposite. And for one to succeed, the other has to fail. A lack of demonstration that our economies and environment, whether it's the promotion of circular and regenerative economies, the fact that they're interlinked is a basis of youth anxiety. The fact that our world leaders are, like Professor Jayashree Sachs said, there's a need to overhaul our financial system. A second and one of the major causes for youth anxiety recently is that the most awaited conference and platform to discuss solutions for climate change, COP26, fell short on climate action, right? The roadmap for updating our NDCs, which are nationally determined contributions, fell short to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius targets, according to the UNEP's analysis. And an example of the same is that the word coal was used in the COP text for the first time, right? The fact that we've known about the causes of climate change for over 2 decades, or like Professor Sachs pointed out, almost 50 years now, actually. But this is the first time we're actually even naming one of the major reasons is absolutely preposterous to us. Furthermore, even after knowing all of this and, seeing hundreds of protests, the world's youth suffering from climate anxiety and calling out the government in what a 2018 study termed dangerous descent, world leaders have still only decided to phase down and not phase out coal systems. As of right now, what the youth believes, and what I'm a major advocate for, is that we need to change our world leaders' approach and sentiment. We need them to feel as anxious about this as we do, right? And many might say that, they were anxious, they are taking steps, the Glasgow Climate Pact is a testament of the same. But from their actions, and the fact that several high carbon emitter countries have only settled for long-term net zero targets in the face of scientific studies, the fact that the youth had to emphasize it by detailing out a global youth statement is testament to the fact that this conversation is not going to compromise with our world leaders as of right now. The youth are ready for this to be a collaboration, for this to be a two-way conversation, because we recognize the fact that, the generation before us has built this, have built the system. They know so much more than us, and we're ready to learn from them and grow together as people who will be inheriting the future of this planet.
Thank you. Mr. Rai, there's an open invitation to the generation of politicians and statespersons from the younger generation. But at the same time, we are told that we are not just facing a climate emergency, but a climate calamity. Now, in terms of what you feel that the Indian Parliament and the people who are decision makers in India should be doing, What is your take? For example, if you were in the parliament today, what would you be demanding?
Okay. First of all, thank you, Professor Reddy, for giving me this opportunity to speak on this very, very important topic. As well as I think the 60 years of India International Center is being commemorated with this is also testimony to your leadership in this particular sphere. So first, first off, I think both Professor Sachs as well as Professor Rockström have placed the position that we are in, the planet is in, so eloquently. And I think this is something which all of us have. And the word used by Ms. Mehta is about the anxiety that feeds into all of us, not just the youth, because people like me have children and we have grandchildren as well. And so therefore, this, does speak to all of us. Now, when I look at it from the point of view of the Indian politician, so there are two very important things that we have to deal with. And the first is the 5-year term of any member of parliament, or for that matter, any government that is elected. And as a result, the thinking boils down to 3 years. And therefore I'm not surprised, which is across the world, that 50 years have gone by in a flash, when actually the climate action was called so far back. And so therefore, this alone is a major kind of a ceiling, which is there in the mindset of all politicians. And so therefore, when you start thinking about politicians and for the Indian politician, I think we have to think in terms of how are we going to get over this mindset? And I do believe that if it was something like a pandemic, the pandemic that we are in the midst of, it was like, all right, we'll get over this pandemic in the next 1 year or the next 2 years. We have to do this, get some global action going, get the science behind it, and do whatever we can. The second, I think, is and I think this is where the tragedy for the people of India is that our parliament doesn't seem to function. And the 10 years that I was there, I cannot say that even during that time, Parliament was actually in disarray, even in those last 10 years. From the simple point of view that how much did we debate all the COPs that happened, or even for that matter, the Paris Accord? Did we really get down to it? Did we really listen after? Did the environment minister come back and then explain to Parliament in greater detail? Was there a sense of urgency amongst politicians? I think not. We did have some amount of discussion around the Sustainable Development Goals, but that's it. What is the Sustainable Development Goal and how far we can go forward with it? So the real call to action, when we talk of the kind of anxiety which Ms. Mehta is talking about, is to get our politicians. And, it just reminds me of what Professor Sachs has said, of what politicians' mindsets are all about, even in the United States, whether they're talking about a mindset which is a 20th century mindset, and you're really not moving into the 21st century. So there has to be some kind of an external force that is going to allow us to think in terms of immediate action. Because I think from whatever I've heard from the speakers before us, it is that we don't have the time. We don't have the luxury of time anymore. And we have to get down to climate action. Yes, our Prime Minister has made some bold statements, but are we going to then follow through with the implementation? Even if we do that much, I think we will be on some firm ground. But policy and action, I think we really need to get a parliament functioning again.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Nandi, you've been covering environmental issues as a journalist, as a seasoned journalist, even despite your young years. So you represent both the aspirations and anxieties of young people, but also would have acquired some cynicism as a journalist at the lack of response from the politicians and the people who are supposed to be steering us towards climate safety. How do you respond to the two presentations that we have had today?
Yes.
Particularly since journalists deal mostly with day-to-day challenges, and climate change is a public health emergency in slow motion.
Absolutely. I think I'm feeling equally anxious. Naaya has, sort of summarized it very well. It's eco-anxiety, and many of us journalists who cover these reports, especially the IPCC report and the Lancet Commission reports, do go through phases of anxiety because we see that the catastrophic consequences are right here. And these two speakers, Professor Rockström and Professor Sachs, have both highlighted certain points which I have taken down, and I would like to sort of repeat those so that there is a summary of what they were trying to highlight. One is about the tipping points. I think there is a gap between how we report on climate change, climate crisis, and whether we are able to merge it with the tipping points. The fact that it's not just global warming and extreme events associated with global warming, but we are actually at a point where there can be irreversible cascading events of impacts, climate impacts, which can turn things towards really, a dark phase for humanity. So that is one thing. As a journalist, my key takeaway would be to also ensure that I report on these tipping points and make these linkages in terms of science. The second thing is, of course, we've been seeing this for the past many years, and again at the Glasgow Climate Change Conference, this happened once again, is politics and short-termism sort of trumps over the larger cause of dealing with climate change. And in this particular case, I would like to be I agree with what Professor Sachs and Professor Rockström said, but India's role and how India would deal with it in future is very closely linked to the availability of climate finance and its position as a developing nation, considering that our per capita emissions are extremely low compared to the global average, and 7 times lower than the US and some 3.5 times lower than China. So coming from a perspective of a developing country, especially with large numbers of people dealing with poverty, I think that the global community has to deliver on the climate finance plan. I mean, there's no getting away from this. And if it doesn't happen through the UN structure, I wonder what are the other options for developing nations to deal with this, because India is also at the receiving end. When Professor Rockström was actually showing those slides, I was wondering that in India, this kind of warming could lead to not just loss of lives, but loss of millions of livelihoods, pushing people even further into poverty and crisis. So the concept of equity and justice needs to be very prominently put out there by India. And like Professor Sachs said, that India can take a leadership position. And I hope it does take a leadership position from the developing countries' point of view. I would like to see that happen. And just a bit on technology also. I mean, there's been a lot of talk on how there will be technology sharing, it will be open, and there will be cooperation, but we don't see that happening. It's catastrophic events are happening right now. When do we have the time to share technology, and what are the legal mechanisms to ensure that countries like India or other countries, other developing countries, have access to these technologies? These are certain things that I thought are my key takeaways.
Thank you. Let me start the concluding round with a question to you and following up on what you just said. Quite often, developing countries, including India, talk about common but differentiated responsibilities. Given the fact that many countries who are high polluters in the past, and even currently so, have reaped the benefits of ecologically destructive development, but we are now being asked to hold our horses and then be much more conservative in terms of use of fossil fuels and many other types of energy which are likely to be contributing to climate change. But there is also a common but differentiated risk. In fact, we are at the much greater risk than those countries who are polluted in the past, because consequences can be catastrophic for developing countries, especially India, whether in terms of warming or in terms of agriculture and food systems also suffering, and very many other ways. So given that, how do we communicate to people that we just can't wait for action, that we also need to raise our voices, act both domestically, but demand global action? And what role can the media play in that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that is one of the reasons why our Prime Minister did make a very ambitious statement at Glasgow, considering that India has high dependence on fossil fuels, but it still continued to, it still went on to announce the net zero goal for 2070. I think what is missing in this story is public response. Of course, there are people like Naaya and there are other groups, but we are not getting the common person to ask for, for example, climate security, insurance in case of crop loss, in case of disasters, timely insurance, or resilience for that matter. What's going to happen in the next 10 years is we are going to see a very steep rise in extreme weather events, which we are already seeing every monsoon, and we are seeing large-scale damage in terms of infrastructure, roads, bridges, etc., landslides. We as journalists, I think we need to take the people's voice forward, but I also want people to, come out and ask these questions, because air pollution, of course, has become quite a bit of a people's issue. But why isn't climate crisis? There's some linkage. We are still not making those links as to how climate crisis is going to affect our lives very directly and our children's lives. So I think that in my reporting, I'm going to use this information to make it more urgent and to put the story out as to how it would affect the common person, and not just environmental groups. It's no more a niche issue. I mean, we've been again and again saying that, oh, these are groups asking for this and protesting, but it's far beyond that. It's actually in everybody's homes. Everybody is affected by this.
Thank you. Yeah. Mr. Rai, how do we actually build a public movement on this? And how will an intergenerational dialogue help in the process? Because so far, most of the decisions are being taken by a generation, when those consequences of those decisions will not reflect in the future on that generation. How can politicians like you, who are actually statespersons, initiate intergenerational dialogues?
Okay, let me give you, I think this question can be answered through an example, because I think that'll make more sense. So we have, I'm the president of the Integrated Mountain Initiative. And this is looking at the entire Himalayan ecosystem, and all the states are represented through our state chapters in the Integrated Mountain Initiative. Now, we are looking at climate change and what it's doing to the Himalayan glaciers, what's it doing to freshwater, what will happen in the future. So all the data points which were narrated by Professor Rockström, we are looking at all of that and saying, how do we build better policies at the level of the state? How do we build resilience? And as recently as just November of last year, we held the 10th Sustainable Mountain Development Summit, which is a flagship event of ours in Darjeeling. And the theme of that was, which is something which would warm your heart, Srinath, is one, health. You know, we're looking at health of the environment or the biodiversity, we're looking at health of the animals, and then we're looking at the health of humans. And overarching, it would lead to. So we have to go through these kinds of lenses to build the policies which would be then impactful in terms of a localized work and pushing it, because if we are just looking for policies and action, then politics becomes so much more important. And that's why the Integrated Mountain Initiative works with politicians as well in all the states that we are talking about. Okay, the Indian Mountain, the Integrated Mountain Initiative across the Himalayan states, or the mountain states, which includes all the northeastern states as well. But the importance of how do we then make it into a people's movement can only happen if you can link, say for instance, the glacial melt or a GLOF event or some of the disastrous events that are taking place to climate change. I think that's where perhaps the media really needs to come. We can talk about it, but if those events are not just talked about as disasters, for which then the state governments go in overdrive, go to the center and say, look, give us more funds, and then we kind of put together a package, and and somehow or the other we tide over that particular event. Look at the events in Uttarakhand. I think there were already 2 events last year, which were devastating in nature. And if you look at the kind of landslides and all the kinds of loss of life and property, which happens year after year in the Himalayan states, it's just devastating. So we have to link it, and that requires, I think, talking to politicians and saying this particular event was on account of this. Or suddenly, if there is a drought somewhere, then we have to also start linking the drought event to climate change and see that we are able to communicate. And then to whom do we communicate? Would be the legislators at the local level or the panchayats, and then we also have the members of parliament. And that's why I always feel that now is the time when, in every such like function also, we are trying to link the pandemic along with climate change, and seeing how different the way the responses of the governments have been, because it hurts the politicians if you don't take action. And so now in climate change, how are you going to make it? How are you going to ensure that it is going to hurt the politician and the politics? How is it going to impact the electorate, and how are they going to vote differently? And so structure it as in such a way that we are able to link it. But I think it requires a much larger kind of a canvas. And, I think Jayashree Nandi would be perhaps the right person to be, because I'm sure she must be dealing with politicians as well, and in linking this kind of, these events to politics and saying, listen, the people are now sick and tired of saying that we are not having water because of whatever the water security is getting, is getting from bad to worse because of this kind of issue. The last point that I'd like to make is, we had done a very, very important event in Gangtok in 2017, which was a we talked about cryosphere, how the cryosphere of the Himalayas are going to get protected for how long. And the question started with just one. And that question was to a researcher. When I asked her, I said, how long will the particular glacier, which is feeding the water supply to Gangtok town, how long is it going to last? And that one question led to a whole lot of studies and later to a very, very important conference. What finally came out of it was that there had to be more studies to be done. And today I must say that particular event of 2017 led to the Sikkim University getting some funds from the Science, Ministry of Science and Technology, and they are starting to do the studies. And I think the answer to that particular question will come in the next 2 to 3 years. So we have to do things like that, and that's the only way forward, which is linking science, linking the politicians, and linking the people who elect the politicians.
And linking global challenges to local impact, and arousing people's interest, because they are more likely to perceive what the damage immediately at hand is going to be at the local community level, rather than just abstractions at the global level.
Right.
Naaya, you've heard 2 generations. You've heard Ms. Nandi as well as Mr. Rai. You are the youngest of the 3 generations now on the panel. What do you take back from here as a message to your generation? Do you feel despair because of the kind of presentations that have come, which have forecast a lot of damage in the future and almost an irreversible nature of climate change? Or do you feel that you can actually create a momentum for a movement which can stall the danger and preserve your future?
Thank you so much for the question, Professor. And I have to say, hearing Professor Rai and Ms. Nandi speak was quite illuminating, especially regarding, what the media can do, how it is for politicians to actually, what does it look like from the other side of things that, most probably our generation doesn't see. And I think that's first and foremost something I will take back. And the second thing I take back is that there is incredible scope for youth involvement. Like Ms. Nandi mentioned, that there's a need for democratic demand. There's a need for change, a change. We need people to speak up. And personally, I believe that this starts from actively involving our youth, from, getting them at all climate negotiations, getting them, be there when decisions are being taken, right? Because young people are deeply aware of this crisis, right? And we've been wishing to engage meaningfully in it. We've been responding to it. We're extremely proactive about it. And the biggest thing I take back is that, yes, all the stakeholders are waking up to the fact that they must harness, the skills, the energy of young people in order to respond effectively in order to bridge that intergenerational gap, like you mentioned, so in order to create a movement. And I think one of the biggest ways in which that can be done is to ensure that young people play a pivotal role. They need to be involved in policy discussions, comprehensive, and there's comprehensive climate-related actions. We need youth NGOs to hold offices of responsibility. We need them to be a part of processes. And today's discussion is a small but extremely important step towards the same, and we need to them. Another thing I take back is the importance of climate education, of free and liberal climate education. Like Professor Rai mentioned, the reason a lot of people are not speaking up about this is because the politicians aren't seeing the link, right? And I think seeing that link and getting people to speak up about that link starts with providing a proper and liberal climate education for all, not just children and young people, but all generations. Obviously in specific children and young people, because there is a need for capacity enhancement of this generation towards climate change mitigation and adaptation by investing in climate change and environmental education, by equipping us with the knowledge and skills to protect ourselves and to contribute to the safe and sustainable future. But I think it's absolutely imperative that we learn from existing organizations, like for example, Shri, which in India has been working extensively towards providing children a platform to voice their opinion while simultaneously upskilling and empowering them. Another organization I've been working with, Climate Science, is a global climate education NGO. I think it's very important that our governments make use of these NGOs, they make use of these organizations and use them to reach out to people to make the decisions that need to be taken, right? And another thing I do take back, and I think it's extremely important, is the need to incorporate nature-based solutions, the need to incorporate biomimicry and sustainability into our actions. And like Professor Rai mentioned, that one small question that was seemingly simple, right? How much time does Gangtok City have left? How much water do they have left? Has sparked an incredible study, an incredible journey of learning. And I think that if there is a major possibility, there is space for it if there's a space for implementation of sustainability, of biomimicry into our knowledge systems, into our design systems. Yes.
Thank you. You have left us with a note of optimism, and we shall close on that. We do have a moral responsibility towards your generation, and we do need to ensure that these debates go on, but we also need to make sure that the voices of young people are heard much more often and much more, I wouldn't say louder, but with much greater clarity that you bring. And therefore, I believe that in the India International Center would be a good venue for intergenerational conversations on issues that concern all of us, so that we can actually collaboratively find the right kind of solutions. Today's event has certainly focused our attention on a major emergency that faces the whole world. But as individuals, as communities, as groups of people living in different countries, we do need to take action at all levels. But working together to create that common response with a great sense of commitment is going to be important. And we do hope that what has been stimulated today will catalyze collective action, particularly through intergenerational dialogues and committed coalitions coming forth to carry the message that we must act with a sense of urgency and responsibility to slow down climate change and to protect the planet. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you so much.
I thank all the panelists for their contributions. Thank you.